Welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi, with me, James.
And me, Matt. Every series on this podcast, we explore the world of science fiction cinema by taking a trip through a different subgenre of sci-fi.
This series, our journey is through the fantastical world of space opera. Hello listeners, and welcome back to Journey Through Sci-Fi. We are here for another episode for your ears, and we have been watching lots and lots of anime, haven't we, Matt?
So much anime. Oh my goodness, so much anime this week, James. I've got square eyes, or I've got massive eyes. I've got massive anime eyes from watching so much anime. How much, can you put it into hours? How much anime do you think we watched for this?
Oh, wow. So I think it's probably about 10 hours maybe?
It's about 10 to 11 hours of anime here.
10 to 11 hours of anime within a week. We've just been watching a lot of anime. What else can I say? But I'm very excited to talk about these two massive anime franchises this week on our journey through space opera. They are quintessential in the anime genre. They made waves over in the UK and the US when they came out later on in the 80s and the 90s for some of them. But we'll get into that later in today's episode. Without further ado, we are talking about Mobile Suit Gundam and Macross, or Super Dimension Fortress Macross.
Or Macross, Do You Remember Love?
Yes, we are covering very specific parts of these franchises because, listeners, as you can imagine, we've watched 11 hours worth of anime, but there's so much to cover in these franchises. We just couldn't delve into them in that kind of way, but we have lots to talk about in today's episode.
But if you haven't seen these shows and you're interested, we hope this episode can be a bit of an intro. Normally, I discourage people from listening to avoid spoilers, but we really are just scratching the surface of these two franchises today. So there will be spoilers for the original 1979 series of Gundam and the original plot of the original Macross series. But both of these franchises have many, many more iterations after that and stretch way, way out. So if you have a passing interest in them, there'll be some spoilers for early on, but perhaps this will get you into them.
Yeah, well said. I would definitely recommend listening in to get into these franchises because there is so much to cover in them. And I want to do a quick shout out as well to the people in our Facebook discussion group, which unfortunately has now been deleted off of Facebook.
They took us down, James.
They took us
Too
down.
controversial.
For whatever reason, the powers that be decided that the page had to go down. But we do have a new Facebook page. But the reason I bring up the discussion group is because we had lots of people in there asking for more episodes around anime. So I'm very happy that we were able to get another one in here. And we also had a lovely tweet from Keith over on Twitter, and he said he was stoked for the Gundam Macross episode. He's seen the original Super Dimension Fortress Macross, aka Robotech, the Macross saga, and Macross Plus, and he said this will be an incentive to finish watching the Gundam compilation movies over on Netflix. Yes, you can watch those movies over on Netflix if you do subscribe to that.
So do come and join us back on the Facebook group. It is back up and running, so if you were a member, or if you weren't a member and you want to come and talk about sci-fi with us, come and find us. It's facebook.com/through sci-fi. Find us there. Enough of that, James. Should we get started with Mobile Suit Gundam from 1979 to 1981?
Yes, I'm ready to pilot my gigantic robot into this episode.
So this franchise is truly enormous. This is one of the biggest media franchises in the world, isn't it? Rivaling the absolute biggest that Hollywood's got to offer. This is huge, stretching across decades, stretching fictionally across centuries, across every kind of media you can imagine: TV, movies, video games. What's your history with Gundam? What did you know about it before we started looking at it for today's episode?
Well, I've always known about Gundam, but it's always hard to think about where to start with this particular franchise. I think a lot of people are familiar with the robot design of the Gundam itself, the titular robot that is in all of the animations. There's merchandise of it, games, you've seen it all. But I've never really known where to start. And because I'm such a completist, I didn't want to jump in at the wrong point.
That doesn't surprise me at all. I think we're quite similar when it comes to that. And I feel the exact same way. I've always been aware of Gundam. I think I'm aware of it through video games, because when I was first getting into video games in the mid to late 90s, PlayStation 2 era, Gundam games were big, and they were surprisingly big here in the UK. Like, they were available. I mean, there's a lot of games that never made it out of Japan in that era of gaming, but you could pick up Gundam games pretty easily, and I'm pretty sure I played one or two of them. But as far as exploring the anime, I feel exactly the same. It's an intimidating franchise, isn't it? Especially if you've got that completist brain bug that makes you want to watch everything and watch it in the correct order. You're looking at, do I go back to a 1979 anime? I mean, that's exactly what we've done today, but then even just looking at the list, and then I've got to watch 20 more different series. It's like, it's very similar to Power Rangers, isn't it? It's like looking at the Power Rangers franchise and being like, there's 50 different types of Power Rangers or Super Sentai, all of that. There's so many iterations of it, and it is intimidating as an outsider. So I'd never set foot in it either.
And there's alternate timelines and bits that's canon and bits that aren't. And it's very much like, where do you even begin with something like Gundam? But we had to begin somewhere. So we went back to 1979 to look at the original series, these compilation movies that they put out. So let's talk a little bit about the conception of Gundam first and why it came about in Japan. So do you know much about the history of Gundam and why it sort of took off and all of that stuff, Matt?
No, this is all new to me. It seems to fit in with kaiju kind of culture. It's a big robot.
Yeah.
That's been popular in Japan for a lot longer than Gundam, but where robots come into the mix, I don't really know.
And of course, we covered Space Battleship Yamato in a previous episode, and that's very much it's like more of a real life sci-fi in a lot of ways. It was quite gritty with what it was talking about. It's very much focused on war. And that's what Yoshiyuki Tomino wanted to focus on with Gundam. He wanted to make something which was more of a realistic science fiction anime. So he wanted to look at more of a almost hard sci-fi anime. So he was taking inspiration from Space Battleship Yamato. And what was really popular at the time in Japan was this genre of super robot anime. So again, like the kaiju stuff, it would predominantly be a teenage protagonist who'd end up with this giant robot and become a superhero, basically. He would be fighting aliens, he would be getting superpowers from this robot, and it would all work in that sort of very fantastical way. And there were lots of animes that came out at that time. There's stuff like Marzinger Z, which came out in 1972. There's one called Getter Robo. There's literally dozens of these massive robots flying around. A lot of the designs are quite similar. They're always quite colourful, but they're being targeted at kids.
So very similar to Transformers then. It's to sell toys a lot of the time. It's understandable. When you take one look at Gundam, you can see that, can't you?
Exactly, and they would have to get a toy brand involved in the animation. So if they got backing from a particular toy brand in Japan, then they could make this show because they know they're going to be able to create a product out of it. So it was quite clever marketing. But what Tomino wanted to do is he wanted to create something which was more gritty, like I said. He put together Gundam, which was this really gritty war anime, and he had really grand ideas for it. But obviously there's clashes with the toy companies. So Clover Toys are making these designs for these Gundam toys. And initially, Tomino wanted it to look like real life. He wanted it to be camouflaged robots fighting in these wars because they've got to be practical. And everything about this is supposed to be more hard sci-fi. So that's what he wanted.
And the films represent more of a closer vision for that, don't they? So they've taken about 40-odd episodes of TV and trimmed out some of the fat, well, most of the fat, I imagine, and brought it closer to his vision of that hard sci-fi idea, right?
Yeah, exactly that. And the thing with Clover Toys, who were the backers making the toy designs for Gundam, is they wanted something which would appeal to kids. So hence you get a Gundam with these, like a white robot with, I think it's blue, red and yellow, and that's more eye-catching. So that's why they couldn't do like a camouflaged robot to make it more realistic. So they've done that, and then the series comes out. They get to episode 39, but the thing is, it's a bit of a flop when it comes out in Japan initially because it doesn't know where its audience is. You're not getting kids watching it because it's too serious, and you're not getting adults watching it because it seems like the wrong category for them. So they don't quite know where their market is at this point. So they get 39 episodes out, squeezed it to 43 so they could finish off the entire series. And then what happens a few years later is Bandai take over rights to the toy designs because they're looking for more stuff to make. And they are making model kits at the time, and they're targeted at teenagers. So teenagers are finally getting these model kits. There's suddenly this audience who want to know more about Gundam. They're watching the reruns of the show, and then suddenly it's found its market. It's a teenage market. It's not just a kids show. And then it suddenly has this big resurgence in Japan, which later leads to these films being made. And I think that's just such an interesting path for this to take, because you couldn't imagine that Gundam could have just been shelved and that we never would have seen it over here.
Yeah. It's crazy to think about the enduring kind of success and various versions that have existed off the back of a cancelled show.
Yeah.
Like, that's absolutely crazy. I find it interesting that there was this focus on quite hard sci-fi, or that was the intention, because the series does, in its second half, or the second half of the three films, veer more towards quite fantastical stuff with the sort of psychic powers that become a major plot point. And, I would say that's actually where things really pick up in the series, and it starts to get really interesting and really good. So it's an interesting sort of tension there that one of the more fantastical elements of it is what I think really makes it quite strong and picks up the pace a little bit.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. And I think this whole idea of war and the focus on war in this, like we had with Space Battleship Yamato, it's very gritty in its nature. You follow these characters and you really go through the trenches with them. But so we had the series coming out in Japan, and then what they do in 1981 is they put out these film compilations, which we're going to be talking about today. And these aren't released over in the US until 98, and they're not dubbed until 99. So it's so long in between when it comes out in Japan and it's really big over there for when it comes over to English-speaking countries. But all of it was so popular over in Japan, it made 5.5 billion yen, which in 1981 was unheard of. And I know we said a similar thing when we did Yamato as well. But again, this is just showing the power of anime in Japan at that time. Yeah, so then we suddenly get it over here. And a whole new audience is introduced to Gundam over in the US. And initially it's through the merchandising again. And then they start showing Gundam Wing, I think it was.
That was the big one when we were kids, wasn't it?
Yeah, so that comes out as the new series to get people into Gundam, and then they start doing reruns of the original Gundam again, and it all sort of spirals off from there and just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But I've talked a lot about what the history of this franchise is, but what the hell is it about?
So, like you say, it's about a war. It's a galactic spanning war between the Federation, the Earth Federation, is it? And the Principality or the Duchy of Zeon. Humanity is like a huge diaspora spread out across the galaxy after leaving Earth. Earth's become overpopulated, polluted. So they've gone out onto these giant colonies called sides. But the Principality of Zeon wants to just be independent, is how we're introduced to it. We learn a lot more about how that came to be and what their intentions were. But they've launched a war of independence and a rebellion to get out from under the Earth Federation's control. That makes it sound like they're the good guys. They're not the good guys. They're the bad guys. The Earth Federation are the good guys. It's a little bit more complex than that. And we do, over the course of the series, see some shades of grey. But the Zeons are not particularly nice people, and they are the aggressors in a pretty brutal war. They've got these cool giant mobile suits, they're called Zaku's, and in response the Earth Federation develops the Gundams, which are their versions of mobile suits. I think I've got everything there. And then a young man named Amuro gets swept up in the conflict when his side is attacked by the Zeons, and in what seems to me to be very typical anime fashion, he just hops inside a Gundam by chance and is a remarkably talented pilot. So far, so generic, I would say, but things get more interesting as it goes along. And then we have a whole 1 year war play out across the whole series. So it's Universal Century year 79 to year 80, matching the years that it ran on television, 1979 to 80. And it tells the entire story of that war in fair detail.
Yeah, and it's a colossal storyline, isn't it? And you mentioned as much as you can about the introduction of it, but as it goes on, you find out more and more about sort of what the Principality of Zeon is, what happened with the Earth Federation, the initial parts of the war, because I think when you find out that half the Earth's population, or I think half of both sides' population, were killed in the first few bits of the war, first few years or whatever it was. And there's been lots of destruction. Now they're still carrying on this fighting. And also the fact that they're using these robots as well to fight is quite interesting. So there's a whole backstory about that. There's something that they use on the battlefield called M particles, or the Minovsky particle, which basically will just knock out all the radar, disrupt all of your electromagnetic equipment and whatnot. So they basically can't do long-range combat in these wars. So they have to create giant robots to fight each other hand-to-hand in space.
It's a nice little concept to throw in if you want to try and make your giant robot show as realistic as possible, that you do need a decent reason for fighting with giant robots in space, basically. It's an interesting example, particularly from the space opera lens, isn't it? Because to me, it really is space opera. It's very fantastical. It's quite silly. Not silly, but, you know, it is fantastical space fantasy, but it has this serious attempt at hard sci-fi as well throughout, and it's mostly realistic, apart from, like I said, getting into the psychic abilities later on.
I mean, the silly aspects come quite early on, I would say, because you've got this group of kids and civilians who are on this base out in space, and they are drawn into this war unsuspectedly. There's a attack on their, I don't know what was it called? It's like their planet or their station, something along their side.
I've got a feeling it's side 7.
So there's an attack on side 7 by the Zeons, and then you've got all of these, like I said, civilians and kids ending up having to become soldiers all of a sudden, because all of the soldiers on side 7 have been killed or are out of action. So they've got to suddenly pilot. Amuro's got to pilot the Gundam, and the rest of them have to control the white base, the big ship that's going to be the main port of call for them for the rest of the series.
Yeah, and it's an interesting concept, isn't it? Because I'd actually say that by the end of the series, it's one of the best things about the show is the development of these young characters who've been kind of forced into military service, basically. But in the first section, it's a really annoying part of it, and it feels really quite lame and cheesy, to me anyway. I didn't like this concept. It just felt like it was like, because it was intended to be a kid's show, basically. So they were trying to force a way of having very young characters, basically, leading the cast, which felt silly. And particularly Amuro, I found Amuro very annoying in the first film, basically, pretty much for the first film. But as it picks up, and quite similar to Space Battleship Yamato, the way that they have to handle the horrors of war, basically, is handled really well and in a really believable way. So by the end, I thought he was an amazing character who'd gone through just, well, a pretty awful year.
I quite like the fact that he has to just pilot the Gundam randomly. I mean, it is that generic anime trope, isn't it, of here's a teenager who ends up piloting a giant robot, because every kid wants to have a giant robot to play around in. But it's the reality of what he's doing, and that comes up pretty quickly, doesn't it? Because he's not supposed to be in the war. But I think later on they change it. I think in some of the subsequent series, they change it so that Amuro is a cadet in the force already. But I like this idea that he's just he's swept up in it, and suddenly he has to be piloting the Gundam and killing all of these people in these other robot suits. His development, again, the way you see his family background is quite interesting.
Yeah.
Because it's his dad who creates the Gundam. Him and his dad had left Earth and had left his mother on Earth. And you meet both of them throughout the 3 films, throughout the series, don't you? And you get very different perspectives on what Amuro's family life is like as well.
Yeah, that's another thing that feels like, to me, a slightly generic anime trope, which is that he's just this annoying kid who falls into a Gundam, but it also just happens that his dad is like the guy who developed the Gundam. That feels like a fairly recurring trope. But then there's another like recurring trope that they do really well here, which is mysterious, weird, possibly deranged absentee fathers in anime, which any anime, I haven't watched that much anime, but basically everyone I've watched has that. I'm thinking Attack on Titan, Naruto does that, Full Metal Alchemist does that. All the heavy hitters have absentee fathers in some way, and they're varying degrees of dangerous or deranged a lot of the time as well. And we get a great example of that in this, when he finally meets back up with his father, who has completely lost it. I think Amuro just speculates that he might have like oxygen deprivation poisoning or something like that, but doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about it or like trying to like get him help or anything. He's just like, wow, dad's lost it. I'm out of here. I'm a soldier now.
Yeah. And that absentee father thing, because that's Darth Vader as well, isn't it?
Yes.
It's all of that kind of space opera trope, the family dynamics of what makes somebody become this space hero who's going to save the day and save the galaxy. It comes down to certain things that they've had to, like the adversities they've had to come through during their lives. And I think that's an interesting part of it.
It's a very emotionally charged type of sci-fi space opera. So it lends itself to these characters that have this emotional baggage, basically. And especially for the hero of a space opera story to rise above emotional baggage to become this kind of swashbuckling hero, which is essentially Amuro's plot arc, isn't it? I think that's quite important for space opera as well. Not across the board. I think we've seen examples where that doesn't happen, but it certainly lends itself to this genre.
But he reels against this being this super soldier almost in the Gundam. And he does become a super soldier when he discovers his emergent type abilities. And that adds another layer to it, other than him just being really good at piloting this giant robot. But his mother as well. His mother, there's a line that she says, like, I am ashamed of you. And I think those are the last words she says to him before he leaves.
Because he attacked someone in a like neutral territory or something like that. It's when he's really getting involved in the idea of being a committed soldier, but is still kind of overcome by his emotions, isn't he? And he can't keep a cool head when he sees enemy soldiers in the neutral village.
And this is like a 16-year-old kid as well.
Yeah.
So there's no wonder that he's having a few doubts about going around becoming a soldier in this colossal war that's happening around him. But he does become quite almost patriotic about it. And there's lots of debates that he has about why he's fighting and what they're fighting for. And that's when a lot of the interesting themes and debates happen throughout the film.
And he has a lot of guilt about fighting as well. And he even like sort of waxes philosophical about what it's like to shoot someone dead versus what it's like to destroy a mobile suit that he knows has a pilot, and that it's easier basically to destroy ships and mobile suits than kill someone with a gun, because he acknowledges this kind of like detachment that he has when he's killing people. It's heavy stuff for what was possibly intended as a kid's show and for a 16-year-old character to be expressing on screen.
Yeah, but I think that's all of the reasons why it's become so enduring though as well. And another one of the enduring things, we've already talked about the Gundam and White Base, but the designs of them, I think they're so striking. I think a lot of things have done similar designs since. It almost combines Space Battleship Yamato, like the White Base is kind of like that. The Gundam's interesting in terms of just its design, but then they've also got gun tanks.
Gun tanks.
And what's the other one? It's
gun cannon.
Gun cannon. So they've got a few different models as well, which is interesting.
And so do the Zeons. They've got the Zakus, I can't even remember the names. Emsweth or something like that towards the end. And the Zeong, I think, is the final thing that Shah pilots at the end of the series. They've got some great names for them as well. And there's some other ones as well. There's smaller fighters on the Federation side as well that do have their own name. It was quite hard to follow all of this stuff because they throw a lot of that stuff at you. But I think like you could tell, even as I was struggling to follow it, that it was like, oh, this is big with the people who are into this. If you're into this, you pick up on these things and you obsess over them and you know exactly what each of them are, and you buy the models and you build them, and then you're waiting to see what the new ones are in the next series and all of that. Like, it's very collectible, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. You want to have all of those toys, those model kits. The name Gundam is an interesting one as well, because initially they were going to call it Gun Boy, but then they decided to change it to Gundam, and the dam, there's lots of different variations as to why that came about. One of the ones that I read about was it's kind of like freedom. So it's like freedom. So they had Gundam because it's all about war, and also like a dam being the stopping point in the war. So it's gonna hold the side. So it's like a dam. Quite an iconic title as well.
Definitely, it sounds cool. Gundam is a cool name for a toy for kids. So yeah, I can see it working, and having the kind of branding across it as well, like Gundam, gun cannon, gun tank. You know, you can imagine playing with each of those toys, and also having the kind of synchronicity of design across those three ships, and also White Base as well. They all kind of look like they belong to the same team. You know, it's well designed. It looks cool. They're nice spaceships, but from a sort of toy manufacturing perspective as well, they go together well as a set, don't they?
But Tomino was obsessed with the practicalities of it as well, wasn't he? He wanted it to look like it could be a feasible thing that someone could make and fight and pilot in somewhere in the future. So I think that kind of adds to it as well. It looks similar to some of these other super robot models, but there's something about the Gundam which made it feasible in some ways, because this is like it was the first realistic robot mecha anime series. So they're thinking about the practicalities of it. They're having to fix the Gundam a lot. There's lots of shit that goes wrong. If you're in a super robot anime, you're fine. You're flying around you've got your superpowers. You're okay. But in this, they're like, oh no, we need to fix this. Can you do this? This isn't working properly. So that adds to the realism.
And also the very presence of the gun tank and gun cannon lends this kind of military support to Gundam. Gundam is still a super robot in the sense that like it's always going to win. It's always the vehicle that kind of tips the tide of battle, and Amuro is the hero of the piece, and he's always out there delivering the decisive blow. But there is that realistic element to having like a squad, and gun tank and gun cannon aren't as good, they're not as amazing design wise as Gundam, but they have to be there to support, and they have to sort of think it out tactically. It's a nice balance of Legend of Galactic Heroes, which is all about very grand scale military tactics from a bird's eye view with a few human stories peppered in. This is a level below that in terms of grand scale, right? It's telling a year's worth of war at a fairly grand scale, but just focusing on this one kind of key spaceship, the White Base and its crew, but you still have this fairly realistic attempt at military tactics and stuff like that when telling that story. So I do wonder if this was a bit of an influence on Legend of Galactic Heroes as well.
Oh, undoubtedly. It must have influenced so many things afterwards. But that moving away from the military tactics and then throwing in stuff like the emergent types is quite interesting. I mean, we touched on this already. So Amuro turns out to be one of these emergent types, and that means that he's got some sort of almost prescience. It's like a spider sense or something like that. So he can kind of read the tide of battle quicker than anybody else. And he can also connect with other people which have this ability, and they can understand each other. And it's all about, they're looking at this as the future of mankind, this next stage in evolution where we can connect in a different way and be slightly superior in some ways, which gets tricky when the Principality of Zeon are saying all of us are emergent types. We are the dominant race. And it gets very Nazi-esque, as you can imagine.
Very openly Nazi-esque, with one of the villains very happily comparing himself to Hitler and saying he's the Universal Century's equivalent of Hitler. It's a little bit on the nose with the to actually have a character say, I am like Hitler. That's when we get into the more complexities of the Principality of Zeon, because the original ideology of Zeon himself was just to have this space where new types can just like flourish and basically be left alone. He was then murdered and usurped, and the Principality of Zeon was named after him to kind of take that ideology but then turn it incredibly militaristic and imperialist. And then we don't just want to live alone and just hang out and be emergent types, or new types they were called in the version I
New
watched.
types, yeah.
They were actually going to take over the entire universe and rule as new types. And that's the core tension and cause of the war. But Amuro is one himself. Sailor, another member of the White Base crew, is one. And by the end of it, it was kind of implied that everyone on the White Base was a new type, and maybe also just everybody everywhere is a new type to varying levels of unlocking their abilities. Is that how you understood things by the end of it as well?
Slightly, yeah, because the next generation, like the little kids that they have on board, who are sometimes comic relief and sometimes it's like, why the hell do we have toddlers on this war base?
Awful characters. Worst thing about the show. Yeah.
Absolutely terrible. So they are implied to have the next stage, and they can hear very clearly Amuro's thoughts towards the end. And it just adds another layer, doesn't it? Having this weird mystical force that they've suddenly gained. And again, like you say, it takes it away from that hard sci-fi edge that it's got.
Definitely.
But I'm not against it because it makes things interesting.
Not at all. It makes things interesting, and it really, for me, when we start to learn more about the new types and the history of Zeon, is where everything just kind of clicked into place and made this show like really great in my opinion. The shades of grey that reveals in the main villain Shah Aznable, the Red Comet, to know that he's actually the son of the Xeon guy who got usurped. So he is our main antagonist. He desperately wants to kill Amuro throughout, but he's also trying to overthrow the kind of royal family of Xeon and get revenge for his father and destroy the current form of the Principality of Xeon and bring about his father's original, much more peaceful intention for the Principality. All of that stuff is tied in with this idea of the new types, and that's where it gets really interesting. And it's really quite weird because when the concept of new types are introduced, and forgive me, I was ploughing through 7 hours of anime, but it kind of felt like it was just dropped in, like as if it wasn't a big deal.
Yeah, but they build it up, don't
yes,
they?
Yeah,
and it's
fair,
like,
fair.
what the hell is this thing that you're talking about here? And if you're watching 39 episodes, and they've dropped in, oh, by the way, there's this thing going on in the background, and then suddenly psychic powers.
I mean, I think that would actually be a better way to experience Gundam. These films are fine. I really enjoyed them, but I have to imagine that letting that play out over a full series, you know, with no expectations of what's going on is really quite satisfying, the kind of slow build towards that. I don't know. I mean, there might be an awful lot of filler that's got cut out for the films that makes it more frustrating to watch. But
I was in two minds about that because the pacing is really quick. You're watching these films, they're 2 hours a piece, but it's so quick. We're moving on to the next fight, the next battle very quickly.
And the next location. And we've talked about this a lot in space opera, that they do hop from one location to another. But weirdly, it feels wrong in these films because it's not a film that's been written as a film with a slightly episodic structure like you'd expect from a space opera. It's episodes that have been stitched together into a movie. And that is incredibly jarring in places, especially when they'll go from a battle and then immediately just be in like another location where another battle is going to start brewing. But they could be on like the other side of the solar system. And if you're tuning in a week later, it's absolutely fine that your characters are now on the other side of the solar system. You assume that roughly a week has transpired and they've made their way to this new location, but it's literally one scene to the next, the way these movies are edited. I don't think it quite works as movies the way they've done them in this example.
Yeah. Although I am a fan of the fact it is a crash course in Gundam, isn't it?
Yes.
It gets you all the core themes, you know the characters, you feel like you've been on the journey by the end of it, and you've done it all in 7 hours.
It does work for that, and clearly it worked in Japan because it saved the franchise and made it what it is today.
Exactly. And you did mention Shah a minute ago. He is a great villain, isn't he?
Phenomenal.
Because
yeah,
you can never quite work out if you're on his side or not sometimes, because he can be so malicious, but he can also be quite charming.
Yeah, and instantly reminded of Reinhardt from Legend of Galactic Heroes, a really interesting, compelling villain with completely understandable motives. And what's so great about Shah is that even when you know his motives and you are feeling sympathy for him, he will go on to do something really cruel and violent. Like his final fight scenes in the mobile suits and then outside of the mobile suits with Amuro are so good, really satisfying. His sister's interrupting and like trying to break them up, and even Amuro at this point is acknowledging that they shouldn't be enemies, they have the same goal, but he's like, no, I just really want to kill this kid, I just hate this kid. And you're like, that's like very murderous of you, but I also understand where he's coming from. He's been fighting the Gundam for a year trying to defeat it for his very complicated own personal reasons. And he just absolutely hates Amuro and he just wants to kill him. And you're like, yeah, I do get it. Like, you're the bad guy in this fight, mate, but I get why you're so worked up.
And he looks foreboding as well, because that weird mask that he's always wearing, obviously we find out why he's wearing that mask, because he is related to the royal family, or the previous royal family. It just makes him more menacing. You can't see his eyes, so there's no emotion in his eyes, and he looks foreboding. He's Darth Vader, isn't he? Again.
Yeah, but then he does also have that emotion in his eyes as well, because we do later on see him without the helmet, and when we're learning more about who he really is and his backstory, he doesn't have the helmet on. He has as much emotion as any other character, but it's like a persona that he puts on, isn't it? Shah the Red Comet, or Char the Red Comet. That's a persona that he wears for the benefit of the Principality and also the Federation. You know, he's got this whole mysterious reputation to uphold.
And he's always flying around in a red mobile suit, isn't he? Because he wants people to know that it's him.
Yeah.
And he's instantly a target, but he knows he can handle himself in combat, so he doesn't care.
Yeah, great character. An enjoyable character from the start, whereas I had to warm to a Moreau over the course of the series, and I really did. And that's true of a lot of them as well, like the supporting characters, like, is it Bright, the captain or lieutenant of the White Base?
Yeah, Bright.
Murai, Sailor, Frau Bo, like these are all
Frau Bow.
Frau Bo.
Well, Frau Bo, like her name, every time it came up, it made me laugh a little bit because people say her full name all the time.
Yeah. Frau is like a name, isn't it? Not a German title for a woman. It seems to be her first name is Frau, but they call her Frau Bow or Frau Boll.
Yeah, which is great.
But yeah, I warmed up to all of them all, you know, as it went along. And there's some great other villains as well in the Zabi family, all just bickering away and unable to cooperate and trying to murder each other all the time.
And there's always little bits of love interest happening. So like Mirai might be in love with one of the pilots one minute, and then our ex pops up in one part of the films, and then
she's just in love with another pilot.
Yeah, all of a sudden, again, I can imagine it in the series. This kind of develops over time,
yeah, sure.
And then there's a thing with Frau and Hayato. I think at one point they've got a bit of a thing going on.
Yeah,
and
when he's rescued. Yeah,
you're like, is Amuro and Frau going to have something, or is that not a thing? And then Amuro has like almost a relationship with this girl he meets once. It's more of a psychic relationship. Lala, I think it is. Lala, yeah, that's an easy way of saying it. So yeah, there's lots of character dynamics happening, and all amongst the backdrop of war.
Yeah, and it's extremely well done throughout. And that backdrop is also really well presented as well. What did you think of just the animation of it and the actual space combat, which is obviously a huge part of this show?
It's iconic, isn't it? Like all of the massive robot battles are so detailed, and you just think of how much work it would have taken to make these animated scenes. We've talked about dogfights in space and capturing that kind of war on screen in a space opera. And with this, the space fights are just incredible. Like when it comes to the final fight, there's just so much going on.
Yeah, I was really impressed with it, and especially it's a real coup de grace to then finish things off with a sword fight, a mano a mano sword fight between the protagonist and the antagonist at the very end. That's a really cool thing to do after 7 hours of giant robots fighting in space. I thought that was a lovely touch. I think that the animation is, I really thought it was like as good as it could have been for a 1979 TV anime, but it left me wanting more. It does look very cool, but I couldn't help but think, oh, Gundam Wing in the mid-90s must look incredible if this is what the original Gundam looks like in 79. I want to see more modern adaptations of this, more money being put into the animation, more time, just more detail, So I want to see more. I want to see what comes next. And I particularly want to see like mid-90s, because that's feels like the anime style is going to be amazing for Gundam in the mid-90s. And maybe that's just because what I remember from seeing it in video games when I was a kid.
And also by that point, they know their audience. They know who they're targeting. They're looking for a teenage audience who will understand these big storylines, but will still get a kick out of seeing giant robots beat the shit out of each other. And as a permanent teenager, do you think that they could make a live action version of this and still create that sense of awe in the space fights and still pull it off?
Maybe. Yeah. There's no reason why not, I don't think. And I'm actually surprised that there isn't one. Is there not has there never been a live action version? In all the iterations of Gundam, is there no live action film version of it?
There was talk of it in the 90s, around about the time when it came out. They were shipping around a script for it, which never came about because they just couldn't make it. And then, well, recently, as of, I think it was last year or this year, Jordan Vogt-Roberts, who directed Kong Skull Island, is apparently going to direct a live action one with Netflix.
Okay.
So that could potentially be really good because he's done giant stuff before. He's done Kong. So there's that.
Are those Netflix live action anime adaptations any good though? I know they did a Full Metal Alchemist one, which I was meaning to watch. I never actually got around to. And did they do the Death Note one as well, or is that not
Yeah,
Netflix?
I don't know if it was Netflix that did that one, but some of them are okay. But I think it helps if it's made in Japan as well, because I think this one's going to be a US retelling of the Gundam story. So I don't know how that will go, because Gundam is so quintessentially Japanese, and you want to demonstrate that on screen, don't you? You want to get that across. I mean, obviously, the story of Gundam is the entire Earth, so you can have people from different nationalities and all of that.
Yeah.
But at its core, it still needs to have that Japanese style to it, I would say.
Yeah, it feels like Gundam is to robots what Godzilla is to kaijus. You know, it's the most significant giant robot franchise. It feels that way as an outsider, anyway. So it's a delicate thing to try and take it to Hollywood respectfully, and Hollywood doesn't have a good history of being respectful in those attempts. So
I know, and especially when it's something which has spawned so many attractions and events over in Japan. There was a Gundam ride. They did this thing called Gundam Crisis, which is where they had a giant Gundam on the floor, and it was in a facility. And it was kind of like an escape room from the looks of it.
Oh
and you would solve a puzzle with handheld devices to try and activate the Gundam for battle.
Oh, that's cool.
Which sounds incredible.
I would absolutely love to do that.
So they did that. In 2009, they built a life-size statue for the 30th anniversary. And then in 2020, they made a life-size moving Gundam in Yokohama, which was 59 feet tall.
Jeez.
And it completes a walk cycle and turns its head, kneels down, and then goes back, which is incredible. So I'm just waiting for them to make real Gundam, which will be the next step. But then also that could lead to a giant war. So maybe we should hold off on that for a little bit.
Yeah.
Especially the way AI is going as well at the moment. That's tricky.
Let's stay out of the real life Gundam game. Well, if you're impressed by 59-foot robot, James, let's start talking about an even bigger robot, which is the Super Dimension Fortress, Macross.
Hi, listeners. If you're enjoying the show and want to support what we do, you can sign up to our Patreon by going to patreon.com/Journey Through Sci-Fi.
And if you subscribe at the warp speed level, you'll get access to our regular bonus episodes, as well as the whole back catalogue.
We've got a host of mini-series, like deep dives into the Terminator and Planet of the Apes franchises, as well as the Bad Movie Bunker, and reviews of the latest sci-fi films.
Plus, you'll get a say in the kind of content we make for our patrons.
We hope to see you there.
Hi. マクロス艦内には5万6千人の男と女が共存していると判明しました。共存だと？バカな。男と女は戦うために作られたはずではないのか。それは初めてこれが民名の歌。
Do you remember Love, Matt? from 1982.
I do now, yeah, because I heard a lovely song about it, and it brought it all back to me. So let's just clear up what we watched here, James. We can make a reasonable claim here to say that we watched the original Macross, but we watched Macross Do You Remember Love, which is essentially a remake of the original TV series Super Dimension Fortress Macross. It's a movie that takes 30 to 40 episodes of that anime series and tells the entire plot across about 2 hours. So different to what we watched in Gundam. Gundam is an edited down compilation of 40 some episodes. Macross Do You Remember Love is a film remake of the original series, but with the same creative team, and I think all the same actors as well came aboard to do this. And I think it's, from what I understand, a fairly faithful retelling of that original series, right?
Yeah, from what I understand, definitely. And I know previously we said we were going to cover Macross Plus as well. We have watched Macross Plus, and we will talk about that a little bit briefly during today's episode. But this film, Do You Remember Love, just fits so much better into our space opera series. Definitely got that space opera vibe to it, which we'll get into. But some listeners may know Macross from Robotech, which was the US animated show. Robotech has a really interesting sort of genesis as well. So it was a company called Harmony Gold, and they needed 65 episodes for syndication for their 13 weeks of programming over in the US. So that was an episode every week. In Japan, anime went out every day of the week. So they only had 36 episodes over in Japan of Macross. So Harmony Gold had bought the rights to show this over in America for their English-speaking audiences. But because they didn't have the right amount of episodes, they ended up taking Super Dimension Fortress Macross, another show, Super Dimension Cavalry Southern Cross, and another show, Genesis Climber Mo Speeder, to meet their quota of 65 episodes. So Robotech ended up being 3 different anime series taken over to America to create this weird storyline which they called Robotech, and they kind of explained it away as different eras of the Robotech universe.
Okay, right. And do they redub it? And, well, they obviously dub it, but do they dub it with entirely new scripts that don't relate to the originals, or is it a faithful adaptation of it?
I think it's faithful adaptations to an extent, but I think they must have played around with some of the lore of it, because it's just too confusing otherwise. And they even did a film later on as well, and they tried to link it to this world of Robotech, but again, it was just another animation that they got the rights to, and it was completely different characters to the ones that the people had followed when they've been watching the series of Robotech, and there was lots of hubbub about how violent it was, because it was a more violent anime that they'd put to screen, and lots of crazy shit like that happened. There was even... So when they put Robotech over in the US, they were obviously wanting to do merchandising as well. Everybody at that point was trying to license Japanese toys of robots. Every giant robot, every micro robot was being licensed over in the US. And in Macross, you've got the main ship that turns into a robot, haven't you? So that was supposed to be licensed by the Robotech guys when they were making that over in America. But Hasbro had snapped that up beforehand, and they turned it into a transformer. So they'd licensed this model as a transformer.
Which one? Do you know?
I think it was Jetfire.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Because I was reminded of Unicron, just the sheer scale of the Macross when it transforms into its robot form.
It's not the giant Macross. It's one of the smaller ships.
Oh, okay, sure.
So the smaller ship, which is all over the place in the Macross series, got licensed by Hasbro, turned into a transformer. So the Robotech guys, Harmony Gold, they've got a show and they can't make toys of their main thing that people want to buy, which is the transforming plane.
What a mess.
Absolute mess. And it's just, again, another fascinating intro into this series. But we're not talking about Robotech.
but all that Robotech stuff just adds on to the complexity of an already fairly complex anime. It's not as bad as Gundam, but this is another intimidatingly large franchise that, the sequels, they do sequel series and OVAs and films and all of this that take place at different parts of the chronology, and it's kind of all over the place. And then to also throw in a whole American series that's just like Frankensteining up all the bits of the anime and turning it into something else. Again, it makes it quite a hard jumping on point for audiences. But Do You Remember Love is a really good jumping on point, again, because it does just bring that whole original story into one single film that's very watchable.
And it is a very interesting story as well, because it's got all of these space opera elements, but it's also at its core about a love triangle. I mean, the whole thing's called Do You Remember Love?
Yeah.
And as a compressed story of the series, it's got new animation. It's been made in a way to condense all the storyline and focus purely on the main events that were happening. And I think it pulls it off, I think it pulls it off as a singular film and doesn't feel as tricky pacing-wise as the Gundam series of films.
Yeah, this is a very different example of how to do this. And it's interesting because I think Gundam is probably better, and I'm more interested in knowing more about the Gundam universe. But just as a single piece of media, this is a much better way of doing this. The real effort has been spent on rewriting an entire 40 episode series and condensing it into just 2 hours of plot and making that work. That cannot be easy, but it seems fairly effortless when you actually watch the movie. There's none of this jumping around where you realise there's been a break between the plot of one episode to the next. That just doesn't happen. It flows as a movie should. And also what I found very noticeable is just the way it looks. The difference in a 1979 TV anime budget versus a 1982, I think this film was remade in, a 1982 movie anime budget. That's only a couple of years, but it's a different galaxy in terms of how it looks. Because this film looks amazing, and this film looks like what I wanted Gundam to look like. It really has a full movie budget behind it, and it looks great.
And it's got a really interesting premise, hasn't it? There's basically an arc ship, the Super Dimension Fortress Macross, which is going around in the galaxy. And there's also a war going on between them, the human race, and the Zentradi. And this is where things get even more hectic.
Yeah. The Zentradi or Zentradi are the aggressors, and they're absolutely massive, which completely caught me by surprise because they're humanoid and you just see them hanging out with each other. And then a third of the way into the film, they encounter the humans and you realise that they are huge, like 20 foot tall, each of the Zentradi. But the Zentradi are also wrapped up in a war that's been going on for hundreds of thousands of years, I think, with the Meltrandi, who are the same race as them, but female. So they just have this centuries-long war with their female counterparts. And the humans are really just caught in the crossfire, I think, right? There's not really a war between the Zentradi and the humans, certainly not from the Zentradi's perspective. They're just a very aggressive alien species.
Yeah, because I think at the start of it, there's talk about there was a war with Earth and the Zentradi, and then they end up getting on the Macross, and then they're escaping the assault because later on in the film they return back to Earth, and Earth is in a shambles. It's felt the effects of war, and they weren't aware of what had happened on Earth in terms of the war itself. So there's lots of stuff going on in that.
But I think when the characters return to Earth, that's when we learn about the history, the whole like backstory of the film. And I got the sense that the devastation of Earth was just crossfire. It was the Zentradi and the Meltrandi, going to war with each other, and they just brought that war into our solar system, and Earth was just caught in their crossfire and completely obliterated. I don't think the Zentradi attacked Earth in a like deliberate aggressor way. But all of this is explained by a computer that doesn't speak Japanese. I don't think it speaks an ancient language that one of the characters can understand in her head, right? Is that so?
Something along those lines, yeah.
So we hear it like a telephone call from her point of view. And that was my understanding of what she was learning, I think.
But besides all of the intricacies of what's happening in this war, we are introduced to a few main characters who are the people that we follow throughout. So we've got hotshot pilot Hikaru Ichiyo, who is the main protagonist. He's running around in his space plane that turns into a robot, shooting stuff up, and ends up being a bit of a reckless pilot at the start. And that's when he meets Lin Minmei, who is this pop star on the Macross, and she's really big. She's a great singer. Everybody knows about her. And it's interesting as well because Lin Minmei actually went on to become a pop star in her own right in Japan. So they turned the voice of the actress who played Minmei into a celebrity by launching her own musical career off the back of this, and became an anime idol. So Lin Minmei became an anime idol and people were buying her music, which is such a key plot point for this because the music is what saves the day in the end. It's all about the Zentradi discovering that they have an adversity to the music at first, and they don't like listening to music. It doesn't sit well with them when they're flying around having wars.
Well, they're these genetically engineered warriors, and they have no sense of culture. They have no real emotions, really. They are just warriors who just go around the galaxy fighting anything that gets in their way. And this interaction with culture in the form of music just kind of throws them off their guard, essentially, and kind of blows their minds. But in particular, we learn it's aspects of, or it's similar to the culture of their creators. And that's why it has this profound kind of impact on them and renders them unable to fight.
And the fact that they don't have these emotions is brought to the forefront by the emotions of the human characters which we're following, who end up in this kind of, well, initially just in this relationship with Minmei and Ichiyo. And then Hayase ends up getting involved as well. So you've got another character who's the lieutenant of the Macross. She's in the military, and then it becomes a love triangle. For the majority of the film, you're like, who's going to end up with who? What's going to happen? And that's kind of the core emotional part of it. But then in the midst of that, one of Minmei gets kidnapped by the Zentradi. There's fights in space. There's all of this crazy stuff. And then every once in a while it'll go into a bit of a meet cute moment.
Yeah.
And it'll become a bit more rom-com-y. So it's mixing a few different things in here with the space opera elements.
Yeah, it's a romantic drama and a kind of pop musical against the backdrop of a space opera scenario and setting. And it's a very weird mixture of genre. Remarkably, they do manage to get away with it and pull it off in incredible fashion by the end of it as well. Like the climax of the movie is this plot point pop song being sung across the solar system while an enormous space battle takes place, which should feel like a complete mess of things thrown together. But I mean, I found it very effective. I found it like surprisingly impactful. It was like, oh, this is absolutely the perfect soundtrack to this scene, especially the way it fits into the plot and everything. And one of the main characters is the one actually singing the song. And
I think with space opera as well, it's so much about music, isn't it? The music that sort of spurs the drama on. Yeah. And this being like a pop love story, as you said, it becomes about that, and it becomes about this final number of the film, which is the climax. And I kept thinking about stuff like Fifth Element, which also uses really interesting music and somebody singing on stage to juxtapose a really exciting action sequence that's happening. And that feels like another space opera element to me. You're kind of mixing these two things together to really make something emotional and impactful, as you do with any big blockbuster. But with this, you've got somebody singing on stage, and that's part of the plot.
It's weird. I mean, I do agree with what you're saying, that the links between, like, the importance of music in space opera, but this just on paper is not the type of music you would expect. Like, you know, it's
J-pop.
Yeah, J-pop, yeah, bubblegum pop. Like, it's not exactly Brian May wailing away on his guitar, you know, like, and maybe that's just like my own tastes, but it felt incredibly strange. But I was very surprised by how much I liked it and how well it worked.
Yeah, and it makes this really great climax to the film.
Yeah.
Going back to the love triangle element of it, as they're sort of figuring out their own relationships, you see the Zentradi males and females, the Zentran and the Meltran.
Battle of the Sexes.
Yeah, Battle of the Sexes. That's exactly what this film is. It's a massive Battle of the Sexes with giant aliens.
Yeah. Yeah, and they are unable to, well, they do not remember love, and they're unable to just get along, basically, which is then played out in a more traditional romantic drama way between the three human main characters.
And the way that the Zentran talk about the Meltran, they're like, oh, they're hideous beasts and they are very dangerous and all of these things. And then when you see them, they're these beautiful giants.
Yeah, but they live up to the reputation, don't they? They absolutely...
Yeah, they are deadly.
Every time they enter the scene, they just wreck everybody that's there. They're the first entrance when the Zentradi are kidnapping the humans and then they're interrupted by a Meltrandi attack. I think it's just one Meltrandi and she just like rips through the whole Zentradi ship, kills everyone in sight, and then she's like... no one can match my fighting skill, and then she leaves. Again, it's another thing that felt like a very stereotypical anime scene to me, like the one really badass character just showing up, wrecking everyone, and then complaining that nobody's badass enough to fight them.
Yeah, but I love all of those elements to it. They may be cheesy, but I think they...
Oh no, I didn't think it was
fun,
cheesy.
Aren't they?
I think a lot of this film should have been cheesy. And I think if you described this to someone who hadn't seen it, it would sound like the maddest, cheesiest film imaginable. But it doesn't feel cheesy like at all in any point of it. It's a great mixing of genres and also some classic anime tropes.
Yeah, the mixing of genres, because have we seen a romantic space opera? Yeah, in this way.
Well, you know, I mean, romance is important in space opera, isn't it? But it tends to be a more swashbuckly type of romance.
That's interesting.
You don't get... We haven't seen a great deal of women with agency in relationships. And I think there's more... And kind of the first half of this love triangle, or the first half of the film, the way it handles the love triangle is really good. I was a little bit disappointed that the kind of conflict when he makes his decision is essentially resolved with him slapping Min Mei in the face and saying, like, get a hold of yourself. And then she just sort of immediately goes, oh, you're right. I'll get over it. And then she does just get over it. I was a little bit disappointed with that, to be honest with you. But I did think that prior to that, in Macross, the love triangle was actually very believable. It was very like kitchen sink realism type drama.
Yeah, well, it's the soap opera element, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. It would, very soap opera against the backdrop of a galactic war with giant green and purple aliens.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. It sounds more like something out of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Just because it's so bonkers, that setup. You kind of think, oh, Ichio's going to end up with Min Mei and that's going to be the scenario. But no, he ends up having this really great relationship with Hayase. And that's all because of what they find on Earth, and they unravel the secret of what happened to Earth and the proto-culture and the big reveal about what was actually going on with the human race at the time.
But also this kind of intense period spent together, stranded on Earth for about a month, I think they say, once they're finally rescued, just exploring the devastation. You know, it's a very emotionally intense time for them. So, yeah, Ichio kind of moves on from... Well, he gets together with Min Mei in a similarly intense way. He's stranded with her for like a week in the bowels of the Macross ship. And then he'll just get stranded with Hayase. So he moves on pretty easily when he gets stranded with a new lady. But you know, you have these reasons to strand the characters together and make them forge a bond.
There's a really nice, poignant moment when Ichio and Hayase are playing house, basically.
Yeah, that was a really good scene. Felt like something out of a Ghibli film.
Yeah, it felt very much like that. It's kind of got that sensibility to it. And so what is the actual reveal? Because again, with so much of this film, it's very hard to hard to get a grip on.
I watched this one twice, James, actually. So I have watched an awful lot of anime for this episode. I watched so much Gundam that then I was worrying that I'd forgotten everything that happened in Macross. So I rewatched this at double speed.
At least you didn't watch Macross and then go, actually, I need to rewatch Gundam. It's a vicious cycle.
So the reveal is that there is this thing called the proto-culture, which is this ancient civilization, very very Halo, very Ringworld, this civilization that came before humanity, and also the Zentradi and the Meltrandi, that didn't live on Earth, lived elsewhere in the galaxy, but they evolved or developed their society past a point where they needed to reproduce, and then the genders went their separate ways and then came back together to go to war with each other. And then they developed these giants, these artificially genetically modified giants to fight on their behalf in that war. And then beyond that, it seems like they decide, actually, we shouldn't be going to war together. We should all get back together and rediscover male-female relationships. So they go and rest up on Earth as a refuge from the war that is still going on that they're responsible for, but they don't seem to have an interest in stopping. So then they go to Earth, do a bit more genetic modifying, create humans, and just seem to forget that there are giant purple and green monsters tearing through the universe until many thousands of years later, the protoculture will die off, and then their spawn come back to Earth and rip it to shreds in their ongoing war. That's the big space opera backdrop to the love triangle pop idol story. And
then they make that song that was 1,000 millions and billions of years ago. It was a great big pop hit, and they just so happened to make exactly the right one.
And to be fair, James, it's a banger.
It is a banger. Will you be listening to that in a billion years?
Yeah, I was humming it to myself. And even watching the film back on double speed for today, I had to turn down the double speed just so I could enjoy the final scene again and listen to the song at its proper speed. And
we talked about in Gundam the massive finale fight in that and how big that is. This is just seems like another level. There's like so many lasers firing.
It's just so good, yeah. And like I was saying, it's what I wanted Gundam to look like, because I think that Gundam built up the plot to that big fight scene more and built up the characters because it was so long. Basically, we just spent a longer time with those characters, and it was this you had more of a hero versus villain showdown, and I wanted it to look like the final fight scene in Macross because it's so good. Everyone's just blowing each other up. There's 3 factions that then become 4 factions, and 3 of those 4 factions team up together to fight the other 4th faction. And amazingly, all of that makes visual sense on screen, which is a tricky thing to pull off, in the best of space operas. And they do all that to a lovely J-pop soundtrack.
Yeah, and there's a giant robot, the giant super dimension fortress Macross.
Giant robot, yeah. There's a Unicron, the Macross, which is the floating city that they've escaped Earth on, is also a transformer, which doesn't make a huge amount of sense. It's really interesting because, from the outside, Macross seems like a Gundam type thing or a Transformers type thing. And that seems like an important visual point that the Macross transforms into a giant robot. But it really doesn't have anything to do with it. It just does that when it needs to get engaged in a fight. But this isn't really about transforming jet fighters and a transforming space station. They're just a sort of cool visual element thrown in. And even looking at Macross Plus, the themes that they carry through, they do have transforming spaceships and that's what's going on in the story. But again, it's a love triangle story with pop music. Like that, those are the themes that the creators of Macross are interested in, and they seem to stick to their guns, at least across 2 of these shows. That's what they're interested in. And it's weird, but I really respect the dedication to it.
Yeah, everything else just seems like a bit of a sideline, doesn't it? All of these giant robots that are fighting. And you can see why they would have had difficulty making this popular when they turned it to Robotech, because so much of, well, I mean, this is the film cut down version and it's completely been remade.
Do they step away from the love triangle stuff and the music stuff in the Robotech?
I think they still have that in there because those characters are still in there. But again, I haven't seen Robotech. Listeners, if you've seen Robotech, I'd love to know more about how that plot line works.
Yeah.
And what are the variations in it. But you talking about the drama element of this as well reminded me of one of the many versions of, again, why this became known as Macross. One of the execs, apparently, in the story that I heard, wanted it to be like Macbeth because Macbeth sounded cool. So he was like, call it Macbeth because it's a drama and there's lots of stuff like that going on. And they were like, no, we'll call it Macross. And you had to explain to me why they went with Macross.
My understanding of Macross is it's a combination of macro, as in very large, which is what the Macross is, and it has to travel across great distances. That's a little bit silly, but obviously, like, this is the people that are involved in this, it's not their first language, so it's fine to make it sort of slightly weird portmanteau. I think Macross is just a cool word. I think it works better to not be deconstructed by its etymology. I think it just sounds cool. It's the Macross. That's all you need to know. You
can't help than try and sort of get etymological with those.
Yeah.
Because like with Gundam, Macross, they're really interesting words and just where that's come from. But again, they're not concerned with any of that. They're more concerned with the emotional elements of this storyline. And I feel like Gundam was concerned with the giant robot fights and all of those brilliant draw points and the realism of war, whereas this is more about love and humanity. And again, in Macross Plus, they explore that further with the introduction of AI and another love triangle, like you were saying. So they're going down that sci-fi and humanity route in this, whereas Gundam's more about space war and throwing a war up in space and then seeing what happens.
But in both cases, from a more technical filmmaking or animation standpoint, I think in Macross Do You Remember Love and Macross Plus, there's such a confidence in how good the robot fighting is going to look that they don't need to focus on it. Like it's the main thing in Gundam. It's about big robots fighting and this realistic war story being told over a year. But I think that like Macross looks amazing. All of the fight scenes in this and Macross Plus look brilliant, but they are secondary, maybe even tertiary to the plot. The plot is the love triangle stuff and the AI stuff that's introduced in Macross Plus. That does sort of suggest that there is a real confidence that like we don't actually need to worry about our transforming robots. We know they're going to look cool, and we can deploy an extremely cool looking action sequence at what looks like the drop of the hat. I know an awful lot of work goes into it, but in a way that looks incredibly effortless on screen. It just shows this incredible confidence in the animation that they have at their disposal, that they can then go on to explore other genres and throw other stuff into the mix and focus more on that and create virtual pop idols and stuff.
Yeah, which is just incredible. And I mean, both Macross and Gundam spawned so much after the initial series. Again, like books and other series and merchandising. And it just shows the power of a space opera as well, I feel like, because I think almost every episode we've covered, we've talked about merchandising in space operas in some shape or form. And these franchises definitely cash in on that, but at the same time create really interesting examples of space opera that not all of us are familiar with, and they are both quite impenetrable, like we said at the start. You wouldn't know where to start with these because they've been going on for so long and there's so many different plot points and things happening. And you do kind of wonder almost, are US space operas coming like that now as well? Is Star Wars becoming a franchise that's so beyond people with so many different sequels that it seems impenetrable? And is that all spawned from this kind of stuff previously?
Yeah, I don't know. I think Star Wars is such a cultural monolith for me anyway, but I wonder what it's like for people in other countries. But I know it's big out in the East, so it's not going to have any difficulty with cultural penetration. I think there's also Star Wars feels like, so far anyway, it's gone in big waves. There was the original trilogy, there was a prequel trilogy, there was a sequel trilogy, and then very soon after that wave of the sequel trilogy, we're in this kind of Disney, mostly TV-based expanded universe that they're creating. So it kind of comes in those waves rather than this steady flow of Gundam content that jumps around the timeline, and they're constantly putting out new stuff, is what it seems to me. But I do think that over time, over the decades, Star Wars is going to become like that, where as people age, and the people who had that interest in the original trilogy, and then they had kids, and there was word of mouth that got the kids interested in the prequel trilogy because of the time between those two sets. These people are going to age and die, sorry, or lose interest or whatever, and there won't be that same kind of generational push to be you've got to watch these films that I watched when I was a kid, because there's more and more waves, and the bit of the franchise that you're most interested in becomes a bit diluted. We're going to see a generation of people who are massive Mandalorian fans and care a bit less about the original trilogy, or maybe they're an Andor fan and they haven't seen anything else from the franchise. And then do you lose that kind of way into the franchise, and does it become a bit like Gundam in 20 to 40 years' time?
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything wrong with either of those. I think if you like what you like, you don't have to watch every single part of every single franchise. But I do worry that, it would be sad if people lost that interest in those originals. But part of me thinks there will always be people, enthusiasts, sci-fi geeks like ourselves, who will go back and retread those steps and look at those original shows, films, and try and get an understanding of why they worked at the time and what they did for the genre moving forward.
So do you think you're going to dip in more to the Macross or Gundam universes, James?
I would like to watch more Gundam, and I would like to watch more Macross. I might watch some of Gundam Wing, as you said, and just see the jump in animation. They've also done a Gundam 00, which is the story before the Mobile Suit Gundam show. Ooh. Which is all nice new animation, and it's kind of the story of what happened to Char beforehand, and tells you a bit more backstory. And with Macross, they've got loads of other films. I'd quite like to watch a bit of the series, and just see
the original series.
Yeah, just to see how it works, because I think it's a bit more. I think there's a bit more comedy elements in it again, but I think that's because they didn't really know where they were going.
I'm quite interested to see what the original Macross series looks like, because there's no way it looks as good as the film that we watched. So I'm interested to see how good it looks. As far as these franchises go, I'm very tempted to keep going with Gundam. If you look at the list of Gundam shows, the thing that makes it so tempting is that the Wikipedia table of all the series includes the year that it's set, and you can see that the first 4 or 5 series, or even more than that, maybe 8 or 9 of them, different series, but they all kind of follow the same chronology of the universal century. So the next one picks up 7 years later, then it's the next year after that, and then 5 years later, and it kind of just goes on like that. And that's very tempting. That's where space opera can get very tempting, because you have these really rich, interesting universes, and to know that there's more accessible. If you left Gundam thinking, I wonder what happens to the Principality of Zeon, well, don't worry about it. There's another series ready to go. But I don't know if I've got the patience to sit through 3 or 4 more series before I get into the really good, cool animation that I want to see, like Gundam Wing. But I am interested in seeing more of the Universal Century timeline.
Yeah, I think there's just so much to look at. And you mentioning about the animation, going back to some of these, like Macross, and seeing what the series is like. One of the things, just to end on, is sometimes they outsource some of the animation to Korea when they had really tight deadlines, and it came back really shoddy.
Oh, really?
Because these people hadn't drawn the animations before. So like their eyes are all over the place. It's been done really quickly. I am almost quite interested to see those elements of it and just see those moments. I think there's an entire episode of Macross where they had to try and make it look like it was the main character was having a weird dream to get away with these crazy animations that they've got back.
Oh no.
Yeah. So stuff like that, absolutely mythical in the canon of the series.
Oh, I don't know if I can handle that. I don't know if I've got time to watch stuff that's genuinely just bad.
At some point, we'll have to do another anime episode and watch another 12 hours of stuff beforehand to prep. But next week, we've got a slightly lighter load, haven't we?
Yeah, we're sticking with animation, but we're heading over to the United States of America to see what Hollywood's doing in the animated space opera space. With and the films that we're looking at for that are Star Chaser: The Legend of Orin from 1985 and Titan AE from 2000. I'm super excited about Titan AE because I remember desperately wanting to watch it when it came out, and I just never did. Even like. I've had my whole life to watch it and just never got around to it.
That's because you've been watching 12 hours of anime.
Yeah, I'm a busy guy.
That's what it is.
I've got a lot of shows on my plate.
Exactly. But it'll be interesting to see what the US of A were doing with space opera in the animated realm as well next time on the show. So we hope you will join us for that.
We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to this episode of Journey Through Sci-Fi.
You can find us at journeythroughsci-fi.com, where you can find links to our social media and join the conversation.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard and want to support us, why not leave us a review on your podcast app of choice? It really helps new people find the show.
You can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/journeythroughsci-fi, where you can receive exclusive bonus episodes every month.
Don't forget to subscribe to the show, and we'll see you again next time for another Journey Through Sci-Fi.